Welcome back to Take a Leap and Transform, a neurodiversity journey. I'm your host, Joseph K. Muscat. Are you ready to take a leap with me? Hello, listeners, and welcome back to this bonus episode with my guest, Hilda Gan. At the end of our interview, Hilda and I were talking that there was so much more that we could have covered, and in particular on why businesses and human resources community should be more inclusive to neurodivergent talent and how they can make that happen. So we decided to record a second episode. Well, Hilda, welcome back.
Glad to be back because, as you said, we were just getting into really looking at it from a neurodiversity perspective. So I'm so glad that we're going to spend a little bit more time today speaking more specifically, in terms of people in neurodiversity who are neurodiverse and coming to work in an environment that will be supportive.
Fantastic. So in our first interview, we went in depth into understanding human resources and even dissecting how the entire management is problematic. With that and all its elements now exposed, let's first start off with your experience. What value can neurodivergent talent bring into a business?
It's really interesting because I think when people think about people who are neurodivergent, they're a little uncomfortable because they don't think or talk like the average person, right? And so they're not sure how to communicate effectively with them. And this is probably a source of a barrier for people to really feel comfortable in the workplace. But what they need to understand is that having people who are neurodivergent is so beneficial in the workplace. Some of the key traits that really will help companies is they're honest. They really are honest people, and they're straightforward. When they speak the truth not in a circumventing way, but an honest way. They're really good at thinking. Their ability to analyze is important. So certain aspects of a business will lend themselves to having excellent staff who are they focus when they work, they focus on what they do, they are analytical, and they have this amazing retention of information so that they will be able to use those gifts in roles that really are compatible. The other thing that people don't realize is that oftentimes people who are neurodivergent like routine. They like the predictability of knowing that they're working 9 to 5, knowing that they come in Monday to Friday. And as a result of it, they're not the kind of people that will pick up the phone and talk to a headhunter and be enticed away, because they really like the kind of knowing what to expect. So if they enjoy the work they're doing and they enjoy the environment, they're the most loyal of loyal staff that you can have. So there's a lot of pluses going on for hiring that outweigh oh, I don't know how to speak with this person because when I talk to them, they seem a little bit different. If we can teach people how to communicate effectively with each other, then those awkward moments become not so awkward anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from my own personal neurodiversity, being visual motor, visual perception, working memory, and dyslexic. When I get into a company, I work for the company, I'm loyal to the company, and I'm always quite honest, and definitely having structure and routine and knowing how to navigate the communication sphere can always be a delight and at the same time a challenge, especially when the other side has difficulty in seeing things and how I see things in my perspective. And having that understanding and structure in place can be very beneficial from my perspective and my personal experience.
Yeah.
So
and that's why I share that, because I think sometimes people think, well, I'm not sure I'll feel comfortable working with this kind of person. But if we learn to understand what those differences are, and they're not insurmountable differences, they're just getting comfortable to be exposed to it, to learn how to communicate effectively in that way. I know that people who are some people who are neurodiverse, they don't take to sarcasm because they don't know how to interpret that, or those little, I'm not sure how you explain it, but sometimes when you say something, those little, like, money doesn't grow on trees, for example. A person who's neurodiverse might try to say, yeah, you're right, there are no money growing on trees. They don't kind of see the analogy. So when people use examples like that, they're trying to interpret it, and they see it literally. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that's where, when you know that, then you don't use those kinds of ways of communicating.
Well, it depends. I mean, you're right in what you're saying. Don't get me wrong. It depends on the different neurodiversity.
Exactly.
Definitely what you're keying to is more of the autistic community. I was kind of recently listening to a different podcast because I'm always researching on different perspectives on the interpretation of neurodiversity, and that's obviously the different interpretations coming from others' personal life experience and what is going on in their region and how things are being interpreted or understood in that particular community. So, for example, I was listening to someone in regards to, I believe in Australia, in regards to dyslexia, and he pointed out something that really hit home for me, which was dyslexic, from his experience and being dyslexic and socializing with other dyslexics, is that dyslexics tend to have the what's what I'm looking for. They tend to say the wrong things and can be very having a somewhat a rude sense of humor or a sarcastic sense of humor. And he's mentioning that his wife's kicking him, every time he says something awkward in a social situation. I'm like, okay, that's what happens to me with my wife. And so yeah, it is a dyslexic thing, and I never really thought of it that way before. And so it depends on, the different communities and how, again, how the mind works and how their particular neurodiversity is interpreted based on their own personal lived experience.
And I think what gets to the point here is that each one of us is unique in our own ways, and how we interpret it is through our own lens. So the example I gave was to help other people recognize there are differences, but they're not insurmountable. But what we need to do is open our ears and our eyes and listen to our differences and try to kind of make them more neutral or positive in creating relationships, rather than divisive and strained in creating relationships.
Absolutely, that you're 100% right on that. And that's why it's important to have these kinds of conversations to bring out that awareness so that when there is that social situation and there is that kind of communication happening, not to be offset by that neurodiverse individual by what they're saying, but actuality understanding that they're being quite honest and open, and they're having a different interpretation. And it's up to you to understand that interpretation, as well as to clarify if there is a misunderstanding on their part or on your own part.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So with that understanding in place, how and what practices can HRs and managers bring to be more open to neurodivergent talent?
I think one of the things is to really get an understanding and education about what makes neurodiverse people unique and in a positive way, and to try to figure out, how do we accommodate. So for example, when we look at resumes, we often look for their job. How many jobs have they had? Are there any gaps? And maybe for the neurodivergent, the gap is hard because it's hard to find another job. So the gap wasn't because they're not good, it's because society really is hard on hiring people who are neurodivergent, because you have to have the right mix. The person needs to be comfortable bringing on this person and recognizing their skill sets and not looking at the awkwardness. And that takes you past if you can get past the resume, then there's the interview. The interview process is not accommodating. It's not accommodating to many neurodivergents because oftentimes conversation isn't easy for them. The social interactions, the bantering that people have, it may then seem strained in the interview. So therefore, oh, what's he like as an individual? So you need to create interviews that are not the standard ask me a question, answer, and I'll answer it for you, and then have a little bit of social. Oh, so what do you do in your spare time? Do you like, the baseball, or do you like soccer or whatever? That's not necessarily going to lend themselves to a person who's neurodivergent, where it might lend themselves to a person who's socially skilled, but may not have the technical skills to do the work, right? So I think one of the things that can be welcoming is understanding that process. The interview process has to be modified for neurodivergents to really show who they are capable of, how they are capable of doing the work and creating an environment. And once you get diversity in the workplace, diversity meaning people who are neurodivergent, people who are LGBTQ, a variety of women and minority ethnic groups in managerial places, the more accepting people become of our uniquenesses and our differences.
For sure. And with that in mind, we have to start. It's kind of funny because I've recently done a workshop as well as a few interviews on the whole process of the recruitment process myself.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
And,
with that in mind, you have to start off with the job advert. The job advert, I sometimes look at job adverts and I don't know if they're writing an essay or it's the first chapter of a novel. The amount of information they put in there, and not only that, but it's this mishmash of essential skills, what they desire to have versus what they need to have, versus this mixed up language of, are you a natural learner or a natural learner, and can you multitask? This double meaning language really throws off a lot of candidates, and particularly neurodivergent candidates, where they might check all the boxes of what you need, but because they're not checking all the boxes of what you want or desire, they end up excluding themselves from the process.
And that's that part of the honesty. Like I'm not qualified, so I'm not going to apply for that, right?
Precisely.
Because of the need. Yeah, and I find it's kind of funny because sometimes people will write down everything they want, right? And the person almost has to be the most perfect, positive, amiable, gifted, skilled person to come join you. And yeah, it's just way too much. I find sometimes when we're doing job postings, I help clients by saying, you can't have 20 things on this list. You need to narrow it down to your top 7. What is 80% of this job include? What are the values that are most important for the culture and the person that you want to hire? So really trying to keep it in priorities and then putting the most prior things you need first. I had a client who was hiring somebody to be in a capacity, but in this particular role, they actually wanted a person who also had respiratory technology designation. Everything else was very generic about this. So I think it was like a researcher type person. That priority RT specialist was number 7 in the bullet points. Do you think the person who's an RT specialist is going to scroll down to point 7 to see it? No, it should be number 1 because that was a criteria. If they don't have that, you don't want to see anybody else, right? So it's really helping educate people that take your job posting seriously. Take your job description seriously. Don't have it so that it's like a chapter book, right? It's got to be streamlined. It really does.
Absolutely. And then of course, you mentioned the RT. So that's what we considered a very strong key word in a job advert. And somebody who has difficulty with their CV in writing their CV, which many neurodivergents have, one of the difficulties they have is being able to communicate their skill sets and be able to sell themselves in their CV, and being able to understand the structure of a CV. And one of those structures is identifying that keyword in the job advert and highlighting that in their CV. So that becomes a challenge for them to be able to communicate effectively in their CV if they're having difficulty in understanding the communication presented to them in the job advert.
In most cases, resumes is just a small fraction. Oftentimes people are hired based on connections. They say that oftentimes the job isn't even posted because people just ask. There is one other thing that I did want to mention. How can human resources help is that they can also train people to be more supportive and understanding and inclusive of people who are neurodivergent. And that's by helping them understand what their skills are and how to communicate with each other effectively. Not you need to know how to communicate with me. We need to learn how to communicate effectively together. And so that's creating education and awareness, and fostering a culture for both employees and coworkers, as well as the manager. All people in the organization need to learn how to do that.
Well, that's a good point, because creating a culture is very interesting in the sense that you began your answer with about accommodation, and that now leads into creating a culture for accommodations. We talked previously about accommodations, and there's a lot of myth surrounding the cost of accommodations. Before we get into how we can provide accommodations, let's first tackle how do we remove the barrier of who's responsible to provide accommodation.
So I'll speak for Canada, because in Canada we have a very, very robust program in all provinces about accommodation. So each province in our country has regulations and expectations that we accommodate people. And so we can request accommodation. And that process lies with safety and with human resources. So really listening to it. And I believe it's oftentimes the staff member that will come forward and ask for accommodation, because an HR person doesn't necessarily know and shouldn't make an assumption to say, hey, you look like you need accommodation for whatever, right? Because that could be seen as an insult. Like, why do you think I need accommodation? I never said I needed accommodation. And maybe they don't have a problem. Like even eyesight's an accommodation. And they might say, I'm sorry, you just insulted me. I don't have a problem with this. So it really should be the employee. And you're right, it doesn't cost a lot of money necessarily. And in our country, we have a duty actually to accommodate up to and including undue hardship. In other words, I'll give you an example. If somebody has mobility issues in terms of walking and they need an elevator, and frankly, it's just a small little company, 10 people, to install an elevator in that organization would be an undue hardship. The company wouldn't be able to afford it. So they don't necessarily need to comply, because it would bankrupt the company to create that accommodation. So these are the kinds of things we do have a duty to accommodate. But sometimes it's simple. Sometimes it's simple by giving people a little bit of extra rest period, maybe offering, to accommodate to the learning style of somebody. whenever we're teaching things, we should create learning styles to accommodate. Maybe it's just recognizing that person needs a little bit of extra time. But again, oftentimes when you bring in people with neurodiversity and you hire them for their gifts and talents, they probably do it better, faster than those people that are just, not as well versed. They say that oftentimes the skill sets people do get hired for, they're average or even above average, particularly when it comes to data and the quality of data. People who are, and I'm talking probably about the autistic, the autism spectrum, they're really gifted in their data and their retention of data and their ability to analyze that data. And there's programs that recognize that and use those gifted people in industries that are related to their expertise.
You're right in what you said earlier, that it's up to the employee to come forward. The question, though, I think, was more referring to the aspect of when an employee comes forward. Yes, there's regulation, but then there's barriers that they may face with the manager or with human resources or the employer in regards to being able to get access to that accommodation, or there might be a delay in getting that accommodation because the manager or the human resources is providing or putting in place particular barriers because either they don't want to provide it, they don't know how to provide it, or there's a whole debate about the cost of it, depending if there is a cost of it or not. So in that perspective, what can managers and employers and HRs do to remove that barrier? So that way, at the end of the day, so when someone comes forward, they're not faced with that barrier or that stigma that interferes with their ability to perform.
That is a tough question, Joseph, that you've asked. And it goes back to, like, some organizations and some individuals are not comfortable, and so they will be awkward. They will create barriers. You're asking me, how can you undo that if there's not a will? If an organization doesn't have the will to it, doesn't have the culture, doesn't support it, doesn't recognize their responsibility as employers to create a place where people are accommodated, feel welcome, there's not a lot one can do about that, But having said that, because companies either willingly embrace that is a responsibility, or find, because of the size of their organization and the regulations and the goodwill that's out there, that they should do it, they will do it. So those people that are not going to change, and they don't care to change, and they are under the protection of regulations, that's going to be difficult for somebody who wants to come forward, right? And I can't change that. But those companies who understand their obligation to accommodate will try, but you're not going to convert everybody in the organization. But if you create and foster this, and you find a place that really embraces a sense of well-being of its people, and they recognize that diversity in its many, many colors really will create a better workplace. Wouldn't it be nice if we had an organization where people did care about each other, supported each other, and that the work that you do, you feel proud of, because you have meaningful work that you're doing that you're really good at. And what you and I are focusing on is that there are a lot of people who are neurodivergent, who are intelligent and can do the work. It's unfortunate the society has barriers for that and makes it hard for them to get that meaningful work. Why do we think that people who are neurodivergent can only do entry-level tasks and be paid minimum wage? Their brains show that statistically they excel in certain areas, average or above average, and are certainly capable of it. It's just that certain aspects create barriers because they aren't the neurotypical, and that's the terminology we give to the average people who are more dominant than those that are more unique and are considered neurodiverse.
Well, yeah, I mean, first off, it's my job to ask the tough questions and kind of throw people,
And I
throw my ideas
invited
a
to come
loop.
back.
You did agree to come back, so I have to ask the tough questions. And you're right. You know, it is a challenge. It depends on the organization. It depends on the culture. Or, you know, you could have a very well-rounded organization, but it's just that one manager or that one HR person that for whatever reason is putting the barrier. And it's
Yeah.
what can that organization do to bring awareness to that individual to remove that barrier, or perhaps even remove that individual or move the employee to another team where they wouldn't have that barrier. It is a challenging question, and it needs to be asked because these are the situations that
Yes.
neurodivergents are facing on a daily basis in their workplaces. Because
So
when we go ahead, sorry.
I can answer the one-off person now, but as a whole organization, very hard to move. What I find is oftentimes people do not have the courage to have difficult conversations. So if you have one person who's a barrier or an obstacle, they often say you can go to HR, but what if HR is the barrier, right? Then that's when you go to somebody else. But what organizations need to do is not solve the one-off issue by creating a policy for the whole organization. And I think that that's what often happens is that I remember when I was in education, and if somebody did something wrong, they didn't go and talk to the individual. They come to it wasn't HR in those days, it was education. And they say, okay, we need to create a policy and we need to train everybody on how to do this. You know, and in my naivety as a 20-year-old, I did this. But after a while, I became politically more astute and aware of how this works. And I said, why is it that we can't just talk to that one person and deal with that one person issue than to create something to make everybody else think that they weren't doing a good job and create a solution of education? That isn't the situation. And what we in HR, we as managers need to do is not procrastinate, not put a blind eye to not dealing with issues. So I can understand why if one time you hear something, you don't deal with it. But when you see a trend, you need to deal with it. So if the trend is that a manager isn't inclusive, doesn't matter if it's neurodivergent or whatever, if a manager or an HR person doesn't seem to be what they should be, people need to talk to that person and share what the expectations is. If the expectation in a culture is to be inclusive, help them understand, number one, this is an expectation. Number two, how they can do it. And if they don't understand how to do it, then you educate them. And if they still don't understand, they may not be the right fit. There's a thing called values-based leadership. When you make tough decisions of whether to terminate somebody or to expect them to change, you base it on what your values are. So if the values of a company or an organization say, we are, we believe in DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And if people are known to be people that intimidate their staff, make them feel as if they're not a part of an organization, then they're not following the values of our organization. So we need to discuss with them the expectation that they follow the values, or they change the way they do it, or progress them to a point of unacceptable behavior and termination. So that's how you deal with it. But you do have to have the courage not to procrastinate. And when you procrastinate, it creates morale issues. It creates performance issues. And there are statistics, studies show that On average, people will wait up to 2 weeks to deal with a problem. That's a long time of inaction. And that the cost, the same study showed that the average cost of things that don't happen as a result of avoidance or procrastination is $7,500. That's all an expense, and it's just not one issue. Obviously, there are many issues over the course of an organization. So what we do need to do is we need to help each other, our managers, our HR, coworkers, to be brave, to have confidence in dealing with awkward conversations.
Well, that's a tough one because, hey, listeners, I want to share with you not one, but two workshops that I've put together to bring awareness and to up-level the skills of employers and managers in human resources. The first workshop aids in building more inclusive environments in the workplace for neurodivergent talent and in developing the skills of management to be more engaging with their teams. I geared the second workshop towards examining and providing practical solutions and how to be more inclusive to neurodivergent talent in the recruitment process. Reach out to me on my website to learn more about this amazing program. I mean, don't get me wrong, I agree with everything you said there. But it's tough because people are afraid to have the conversation.
I know.
There is that fear, there is that anxiety. I mean, just in my previous career, where I was a professional photographer for 20 plus years, and I always had to have that call with a client. You would see it from both ends, from the client or from me, where they're delaying to make that phone call or to return that phone call. There's that fear of having that conversation. But deep down, I know that eventually I'm going to have to make that phone call. Yeah. Eventually, they're going to have to pick up the phone and have that conversation with me. But it's that fear, and it's getting over that fear and finally being willing to have that conversation. Not only is it getting over the fear, it's also because you end up telling yourself stories, and stories end up building up more of that fear. And at the same time, though, if you shape the stories correctly, you prepare yourself for how you're going to have that conversation. And then you prepare yourself of how you're going to communicate. But overall, the challenge there is, how do you communicate properly and be an advocate?
Yeah. I as you can tell, communication is an important part of who I am, and I try to help leaders, teams build better, healthier communications. And it starts with 101, but we're talking about difficult conversations now. And I created a formula, 5 tips on how to have those healthier conversations during these difficult conversations. I call it building confidence in difficult conversations. And I have a 5-step process. And the first process is, let's talk about the planned one where you need to make that phone call. Find that first sentence that will start it off, and find that sentence using neutral words. State the facts. Don't make assumptions. Don't predict what the problem is. Just state the facts. And then listen and allow that person to talk and listen some more, and continue to listen so you understand the situation. That will give you time for your heart to stop racing, for you to hear what that person has to say, and you don't have to respond right away. So this buys time for you to calm your nerves on that. So to me, the easiest thing I can share is that when you have an awkward conversation, think about what you're going to say and say it in a very neutral, respectful tone, and listen. And that's 2 of the steps. And people go on my website, they can learn more about it. But that in itself helps. And the more you try doing it, the easier it gets. It got to the point at my company where they'd say, okay, Hilda, we need you to have this conversation. And I tried to teach some of them how to have the conversation, but sometimes it needed me to go in. But the more you try it, the easier it gets. but for those who've never tried it, of course, it'll always be awkward and difficult. But the more you do it, the more it's not so bad after all.
For sure, and thank you for sharing those tips. Quite often we'll hear that what been talking about is for larger companies. And
Mhm.
I often hear, particularly for SMBs and SMEs, that they're too small to be inclusive to neurodivergent talent. This can be very true when they don't even have HR in their organization. What is your view on this? And what can they do to go beyond this mindset?
That is a tough one because a lot of companies will be concerned for productivity. They are afraid if they hire a neurodivergent that the productivity would be going down, and that person's productivity will affect, if they're less than the others, will affect the others. And so again, it's part of education. It's part of helping them understand. And sometimes it's just people's experiences. Those companies that have had people who are neurodivergent are much more understanding and tolerant of it. So they will start doing it. They'll start educating. But it is hard to convince people to hire people who are diverse in many, many different ways, right? Because there's always the concern and the stigma of it.
Fair enough. That kind of goes around what we've been talking about previously, and even in the previous interview we did in regards to culture and trying to change that culture. And you have actually mentioned a program through our previous conversations before the interview that is in Canada, but also in other countries. Can you talk about this program?
I'm happy to talk about it. It is for larger companies. That's why I couldn't respond to the smaller companies. But it's called specialist turn. So think of the word intern. So it's an internship, and it's for specialist. And it was created by a person whose name is Thorkel Sona. He is in Denmark, and he had a son who at the age of 3 was diagnosed with autism. And he thought that his world, had changed, because now he had a son with autism. And in the end, he decided to do something really good with this person in the family who had autism. And what he did was he started to research when his son was an adolescent, thinking, now how will my son get a job? And he recognized that there was prejudice in the workplace, and that a lot of people who were very smart, capable, as we talked about in the opening, that they were gifted, couldn't get jobs other than maybe entry-level jobs. And he didn't want that for his son. So what he did was he was proactive. He created a program that would help people understand and hire people who were, in his case, on the autism spectrum. And the program was such that it did 3 components. It helped employers understand the value of hiring people who were neurodiverse. Then it helped the people get employment, and then to educate people once they got hired to do that. And so today, that was in 2004, he created this program in Denmark. And today there are over 14 countries that have a specialist turn program, Canada being one of them. Do you want me to share the others in case your listeners are thinking, hey, do I have it in my country?
Please do.
Okay, so Australia, Austria, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, France, Ireland, Italy, Mexico, Singapore, Spain, and USA. Actually, it is Iceland, Northern Ireland and Iceland. And they have provided over 10,000 autistic employees. And what they've done in Canada, actually some of the larger companies found that it was really beneficial to have these people who are really, really good with their data, their knowledge, and the quality and the focused attention. So companies like IBM, major consulting firms like KPMG and Deloitte Touche, banks, major banks like CIBC, Bank, TD Bank, they have embraced this program. So what they do is they post a job, then the individuals apply for the jobs, then they go to a place where they're actually assessed in like a 1-day workshop. And so they're showing how their skills can be used. They're having conversations. So the interview is not the kind of interview that you would have in a typical job, but they are interviewing you from that sensitivity to the neurodiversity, so that you get to see the person's true self rather than their ability or lack of ability to socialize and create a feeling of conversation that says, oh yeah, that seems like a good fit for our company. So it's an amazing program started by this man, Thorkel Sonne, Sonne.
That's interesting because they're being interviewed for being allowed for who they are rather than who they're supposed to be. I understand that it's for larger companies, but with that in mind, the principles can be applied to smaller companies, and it's just understanding for those smaller companies to where to focus on, and as you stated, understanding that it's not going to be bringing down productivity, but actually increasing productivity when you change that mindset and you focus on the inclusion and you focus on the strengths and value that individual or individuals can bring to that organization. Now, I want to flip this a little bit, because when we talk about, part of the challenge is a little bit in regards to if someone's disclosed. And obviously, when a neurodivergent discloses, there's obviously the fear, stigma, and the reaction that follows. So what can managers and human resources do when disclosure occurs, and how to ensure that disclosure may not even be necessary, but still be able to provide that inclusion?
Again, a very, very tough question, right? Because it is a dual-edged sword. When you disclose, then you may be subject to prejudice. And even when a person doesn't think they're prejudiced, there may be what's that concept of unconscious bias, where they suddenly, even though they're trying to be open-minded, they think, oh, I had an experience once where we hired somebody and it didn't work out, right? So it is a tough kind of question to ask, and it is a dual-edged sword. In Ontario, our accessibility program covers the employment aspect, and as part of our expectation is we're supposed to say, you're coming to an interview, is there anything that we need to do to accommodate you? This isn't necessarily self-disclosing that you are neurodivergent, but you may say, if there are any expectations of something that I have to read ahead of time, I would appreciate getting that 24 hours before or 48 hours beforehand. And that's not saying that you're dyslexic and you have to be able to read it and not on the spot, but ahead of time. But you could be asking to read it for a variety of reasons. Maybe your eyes are hard of seeing and you can't just read it on the spot. So in some ways you might be able to share things in a more general term. I would advise people who are neurodivergent to understand what their strengths are, to be able to articulate them in a very positive way, and then to think about some of those things that are challenges, and to be able to, again, express them in a neutral or positive way, that people understand that they need some accommodation. The thing is, it isn't big accommodation. These are not earth-shattering accommodations that you ask of people. Even people who are, I'll call it socially, awkward. I mean, average neurotypicals are also socially awkward as well. So it isn't it isn't a stereotypical problem, and it isn't unsurmountable. But I think what people need to know is once they learn about people's differences, that they can learn to communicate effectively. And I know in the specialist term programs, they have found when they adopted the program, they realized what a gift it was to have these neurodivergent people in their workplace. It created a healthier work culture. You know, people who were in the program were feeling a sense of belonging, and they loved the routine. They loved that they were valued for their work. And conversely, managers and coworkers to say, "Oh, he's so funny. You know, I'm glad I got to know him," because they know they're different. But in knowing how they are, they got to put a face and a person to a, a a condition or a challenge that a person has that isn't such a big thing. And that's what we need more. We need to be more open in discussing these differences that we have as people, and not to see them as unsurmountable.
I agree with you there, and it's interesting because you kind of answered the next question, which is basically providing a value proposition, where the candidate or the employee needs to be able to communicate effectively of how their strengths bring value to the organization or to the team, and at the same time saying, this is where I have challenges, and this is where how you can support me with my challenges so I can focus on my strengths. And that needs, again, as you put it, they need to learn how to communicate that effectively, that is in their favor.
You know, and I think if they are really talented in certain ways, they need to learn to get comfortable advocating for, this is what I do really well. You know, sometimes I can't get my words across that well, but if you hire me, you will get such, you know, a quality work, capable, you know. I think maybe neurodivergence should practice how they sell themselves. It's not an easy world, even for neurotypicals. Most resumes just they just sit in a pile, right? It's really hard to shine, no matter who you are. It's a tough slog out there to get the jobs, and yet people do it successfully. There are people who have, you know, have successfully gotten jobs and continue to deliver their strengths, and people understand their nuances. And sometimes people are not even diagnosed as having neurodiversity until late in life, because they learn to accommodate that. They learn to not let people see the sides that were of a major concern, and really help those other areas shine.
I agree with you that they need to advocate for themselves and be able to have a space. I think the challenges has to come from the employer, where even the HR in management, where they allow that space to give the employee that space to be able to communicate. Otherwise, then that whole procrastination and that whole fear starts to pop up again, because that space isn't being given. You know, as you stated, that could have an impact on productivity in general, not only for that individual, but for the whole entire team that individual is part of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is tough to create neuro. It's tough to create healthy work cultures where diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging happen. And I know that that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about, is creating cultures of what I'll call inclusivity and belonging. The diversity and the equity is more about numbers. It's more about trying to create a framework. It's the inclusivity and the belonging that is the action part of DEIB. And my concept of Rev Up, you know, where you treat people with respect, you look at them as equals, and you value who they are for who they are. then you look at the uniqueness. And today we've been spending a lot of time talking about the understanding and learning the uniqueness of neurodivergence. And when you find that, you tap into that potential. And when you do that, you will create a much more inclusive work culture. And statistics show that when you bring in diversity in all of its forms, you can create a healthier work culture. And we talked about belonging, and we talked about tolerance. When people don't align with these values, you need to educate them. You need to share that this is the expectation. Because when you have people who are bullies, who are ignorant, who don't want to change, by not saying anything, you're giving them permission to continue to be that way. When you have the courage, all of us, to speak up for a sense of inclusiveness, a sense of hearing other people and being more tolerant and being more accepting, then you create a culture that's the expectation, not allowing those people who are really not creating an inclusive work culture to continue to do that kind of communication.
Yeah, I have to agree on that. Again, coming from a personal experience where prior to my advocacy, I wasn't an advocate for myself. And I allowed, I take the blame on my part where I allowed that abusive behavior to occur by not standing up and being an advocate. At the same time, though, the work culture and the director above the manager also allowed it to happen and didn't intervene. And the colleagues, I often call them accessories to the crime, where they either put their head in the sand or they look the other way. By not speaking up and not saying anything, they allow that behavior to continue. And that's where you get the reverse, where it happens, where you get a situation where they may turn around to their teammates and say that perhaps this isn't the job for you. In other words, blaming the victim in that situation and saying that perhaps you should be the one to leave and go somewhere else, rather than saying that that particular manager or that particular colleague is the problem and we need to do something about them.
I think we are all a part of what you said. We're all guilty of not doing more, of being accepting of where we stood. I'm of Asian background. I never really kicked up waters, and I didn't feel I needed to. But I think the point is, all of us back then didn't understand the value of creating a more inclusive work culture. And so today, I think there's a greater awareness, and more people are trying to create a more inclusive work culture. And in organizations, what you need are champions. You're not going to change everybody, but if you've got champions who will help, advocate, support, stand up for themselves, and I'm not talking about standing up and waving a flag, boldly and wildly. It's about respectfully embracing inclusivity, having conversations, supporting each other, and sharing that it's not tolerated. When I do my training about difficult conversations, we often have one where I talk about workplace harassment, and one group didn't even recognize it was a harassment issue. They just said, "Oh, well, next time we'll tell people that who's not going to be here at a meeting," because somebody yelled at somebody who wasn't there at a meeting. And I said, "You totally missed the point. You totally missed the point that somebody was saying something that was a harassment, a verbal harassment about somebody who wasn't there. And you condoned it by not saying anything and deciding to talk to somebody quietly outside the room, rather than saying, we really shouldn't be talking about people this way. We need to think about," and really boldly saying this was not acceptable, but they stayed silent. So the fact that these managers in this what if scenario didn't recognize that it was harassment, and that their silence was supporting this perpetuation of not creating inclusivity. So I think, again, I'm not advocating that we all stick up and fight. I'm advocating is that when we all have a responsibility to respectfully have conversations that open up the barriers to having us be more inclusive. And when we create a culture that's more tolerant and or accepting of inclusivity, and we can speak freely without feeling that there is a barrier or that we will be yelled at for what we're doing, then we can create, again, more healthier work cultures. I'm not a revolutionary, I'm an evolutionary. And I think it needs to come, not slow evolutionary, but it needs to be that we all are comfortable and brave enough to have those difficult or awkward conversations.
I'm going to say something here. You're right about the evolution, but sometimes, in particular in work culture or in culture in general, in order to have that evolution, you have to have a revolution. Otherwise, it becomes, as you stated, too slow. There's often the debate, especially from not to get political here, but from the conservative perspective, that eventually in time the morality would catch up. Okay, yeah, they have a point, but the point being is it going to happen tomorrow or is it going to happen in 100 years from now? That's why you need to have those revolutions to speed up the process to be relatively sooner rather than too late. And this is where, this kind of conversations need to happen within the workplace, where there is that change happening, especially since we've seen from COVID, as it was a headache, it actually created that momentum to bring in more awareness or more change. Otherwise, the status quo would have stayed where it was, and the neurodiversity movement itself would not have moved the way it has in the last 4 years. But that's my opinion.
Well, COVID was sort of that revolution, right?
It was.
I think when I see what's out there in DEI, people have stalled past the strategy stage, and I, in my quiet way, is advocating for more inclusivity. And my Rev Up approach will really help managers, whether they're HR managers or project-based managers, help them to get more confident and comfortable in creating places where people feel uplifted and motivated and included. So I'm on a mission to help organizations really be better people leaders and manage. And that includes the inclusivity, that includes my Rev Up approach, and communicating effectively so that your role as a leader is to uplift and motivate and make people feel a sense of belonging. So I'm not going to be the revolutionary. I'm going to be the evolutionary. You can go find another person to be the revolutionary person.
Fair enough. But I just wanted to throw that caveat.
Oh, you're challenging me all the time.
Well, once again, we've covered quite a lot, Hilda. And you've mentioned the Rev Up. So I'm going to ask, even though you've already mentioned it, and you've actually already shared through the whole entire conversation, bits and pieces of your own personal approach and philosophy that derives from Rev Up. How can employers and managers and human resources use your Rev Up philosophy to become more inclusive?
I think, they can contact me to learn more. It is based on the success my husband and I had of creating a place where people loved what they did and loved where they work. And we became one of the best workplaces in Canada, top 10 twice. So I know it's a recipe that works. And when we sold that business and I started my consulting business, I recognized a need to help managers because I feel managers, and human resources are managers as well, are the key to making a difference in the workplace. So my program is a training program that helps people be better managers, to create trusting relationships, to embrace inclusivity. And that comes from that rev up concept, where we teach the concept itself, but also how to communicate effectively using that. So people can contact me. The philosophy itself you can modify, because let's face it, respect, equality, and value are qualities we all should have as people, but it's that key of looking at uniqueness and tapping into potential. And people can figure out how they want to do it in their organization, or they can, again, talk to me about how we can help make that happen.
Fantastic. Well, Hilda, we ended off our last interview with indicating that I'm sure that there was a lot we could cover, and we sure enough did that in this interview.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your insight and time. Hilda has provided all her contact details in the last episode and currently in this episode, so I will provide them in the show notes. I also encourage you to continue to support this podcast so I can bring you more amazing content. You can do so by visiting my Patreon page, where you can connect with me more directly with several options. Till next time, take a leap and transform.